All right, everybody, welcome back. We're doing a deep dive today on public sector pay in Germany.
Oh, yeah.
We've got a whole bunch of news articles and some really interesting Reddit threads that we're going to be looking at.
Sounds spicy.
It is a little bit spicy, especially if you live in Germany and you rely on public services.
For sure.
Because basically what's happening is the public sector unions are gearing up for some pretty intense negotiations, and we're going to try to figure out what's going on, how it might affect you. And yeah, just sort of like explore all the angles of this story.
I think the interesting thing here is this is a story about people, right? It's not just about numbers.
Yeah.
It's about the people who work in the public sector. It's about the people who rely on these services.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So to get us started, why don't we lay out kind of like the basics of who the players are in this whole negotiation?
Sure.
So we've got two major unions, the Beamtenbund, which is often shortened to DI, and then we've got Ver.di. And these two unions represent a huge chunk of Germany's public sector workers.
Yeah, and they're asking for a lot. They want an 8% raise.
Whoa.
Or at least 350 euros more per month for every worker.
Okay, so last year, we saw some pretty big strikes in Germany.
Yeah.
And that ended up with a 5.5% raise, which was already the largest in decades.
That's right. The biggest raise they've had in a very long time.
So to go from 5.5 to 8, that's a big jump.
It is a big jump.
So what's going on? Like, what's fueling these demands?
Or I think one of the key things that we're seeing in a lot of these articles is this issue of worker shortages.
Right. There's a ton of articles about that.
A ton of, I think the number was something like 570,000 unfilled jobs right now.
That's wild.
It's wild. And it's only going to get worse because you've got another 1.4 million workers who are heading towards retirement in the next 10 years.
Wow. So that's a lot of empty desks.
It's a lot of empty desks. And what that means is, longer wait times, delayed services, burnt out employees who are trying to do the work of 2 or 3 people.
And I saw somebody on Reddit was saying that they had to wait 6 months just to register their car because the offices were so understaffed.
Oof. Yeah, I can imagine that would be incredibly frustrating.
Yeah. And it's not just the quantity of workers. It's also the qualities of applicants is becoming a major concern.
Totally. And that came up a lot in these Reddit discussions. People were saying that, it's really difficult to find qualified people because public sector pay just can't compete with the private sector.
Especially in certain fields. I feel like I've heard a lot about IT in particular.
Oh, yeah. IT is a huge one. There was actually this one Reddit user who said they'd been trying to fill an IT position for 2 years.
Right.
And they just kept getting applications from people who were totally unqualified because the pay was too low.
Yeah, it makes sense. If you can make twice as much doing the same job in the private sector, why would you stay in the public sector?
Exactly.
And it's interesting because the unions aren't just asking for more money. They're also asking for things like, improved work-life balance. They want 3 more days of leave, and they want this thing called a more time for me account, which would basically give workers more flexibility in scheduling their hours.
That sounds nice.
Right, sign me up.
Yeah, seriously.
But it seems like they're really trying to address multiple pain points here, not just wages.
Totally. And I think this ties into a broader trend that we're seeing globally, this idea that people are looking for better work-life balance.
Yeah, absolutely, especially younger generation.
Yeah, for sure. They're not willing to sacrifice everything for work.
Yeah, but I'm wondering, how can cities and towns afford all of this? I know that a lot of places in Germany are already struggling with their budgets.
Yeah, that's a good question. And this is something that the DV has been particularly vocal about.
Okay.
They're saying, workers shouldn't have to solve these financial problems through, pay cuts or concessions.
Yeah.
And they're basically calling for a renegotiation of municipal finances.
So what does that mean?
Well, essentially it means taking a look at how funding is allocated between the federal government, the state governments, and the local governments.
Okay.
Because their argument is that, the federal and state governments have kind of dumped all these responsibilities on the local governments without giving them enough money to actually do it properly.
So it's like they're saying, hey, you can't keep giving us more work without giving us more resources.
Exactly. And that's a point that came up a lot on Reddit, too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was this whole debate about, who should be paying for all of this. And some people were arguing that, ultimately, it's the people who work in the private sector.
Yeah, right, because they're the ones paying taxes.
Exactly. And that raises a whole other set of questions about, the balance between public and private interests.
Right, because if you raise taxes too much, then that could hurt the private sector.
Exactly. It's a very complex web.
Yeah, it's a very complicated issue, but it's also like a really important one
Right.
because it affects everybody.
For sure. And it really gets to the heart of like what kind of society we want to live in.
Yeah, and what we value.
Exactly.
Okay, well, let's maybe take a closer look at this whole issue of the IT brain drain, because that seems to be a really big part of this story.
Oh, yeah, it's a huge issue.
One of the articles was saying that there's going to be a shortage of something like 140,000 IT specialists in Germany.
By 2032, which is not that far away.
That's right. And it's not just about the numbers, it's also about losing expertise.
Institutional knowledge. And it's not just IT workers either. Like,
Yeah.
there was this one article that mentioned finance officials
Yeah.
leaving the public sector to go work for private firms
Really?
and potentially using their insider knowledge to help their clients avoid paying taxes.
Wow, that's kind of messed up.
Yeah, it is kind of messed up, but it's also like a symptom of this larger problem.
Right. If the government can't offer competitive salaries and benefits, then they're going to lose their best people.
Exactly. And that's going to have a ripple effect on everything.
Yeah, it's scary to think about.
It is scary, especially with digitalization becoming so important.
Right, because if the government can't keep up with technology, then it's going to be really hard for them to provide efficient services.
Exactly. And to stay competitive on a global level.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about this idea of municipal finances. But I think it might be helpful to just break that down a little bit more for our listeners.
Sure.
What exactly are we talking about when we say municipal finances?
So basically, we're talking about the budgets of cities and towns.
Okay.
Like, where does their money come from and how do they spend it?
Go.
And in Germany, municipalities are responsible for a lot of things, schools, hospitals, trash collection, public transportation.
It's a lot of essential services.
It is. And their ability to provide those services depends on how much money they get from the federal government,
Right.
from the state government, and from their own local taxes.
So the unions are basically arguing that this current funding structure isn't working.
Exactly. They're saying that you can't expect us to provide all these services if you don't give us the money to do it properly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it raises this question of can you really expect to attract good people?
Right.
If you're not offering competitive salaries and benefits.
Right. And can you expect cities to provide high-quality services if they're constantly strapped for cash?
Exactly. It's a really tough situation.
Yeah, it seems like everybody's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah. And it's going to be really interesting to see how this all plays out.
Yeah, because the stakes are high.
Very high.
For everyone involved.
For everyone.
Workers want fair compensation and better work-life balance. Cities are struggling to make ends meet.
Right.
And citizens are caught in the middle.
Exactly. And ultimately, it's the citizens who are going to feel the impact of all of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's definitely something worth paying attention to.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think this is a good place to maybe take a break. We've laid out a lot of the basics here, and in the next part, we can start to dig into some of those social media insights.
Sounds good.
Because I think those really give us a sense of how people are feeling about all of this.
Yeah, it's the human side of the story.
Exactly.
I'm excited to dive into that.
Me too.
Oh.
All right, we'll be right back after a short break. Okay, so we're back, and we've been digging into this whole public sector pay situation in Germany.
Yeah, lots of interesting angles here.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that really stood out to me when we were looking at those Reddit threads was this concern about the growing pay gap between entry-level positions and more experienced positions in the public sector.
Yeah, it's a big issue.
And some people were saying it's making promotions less appealing.
Right.
You hit a ceiling pretty quickly, even if you're good at your job.
Yeah, and it makes sense if you think about it. If you're an ambitious person and you want to kind of climb the career ladder, but the rewards for doing that in the public sector aren't that great, then why would you stay?
Yeah, you're going to go somewhere where you can make more money.
Exactly.
And have more opportunities.
Exactly. So it's not just about attracting people, it's also about keeping them.
Right, it's about retention.
Exactly.
And this kind of ties back into that whole IT brain drain thing we were talking about.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Because if young IT professionals don't even see the public sector as a viable career option in the first place, that's a huge problem.
It is, and it's a problem that's only going to get worse.
Right.
As we become more and more reliant on technology.
Yeah, everything is going digital these days.
Exactly. So if you want to have modern, efficient government services,
Right.
you need people who know how to build and maintain those systems.
But isn't there like kind of a paradox there? Because if digitalization is supposed to make things more efficient,
Yeah.
wouldn't that potentially lead to fewer jobs in the long run?
That's a good question, and it's definitely something that people are worried about.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that technology doesn't just replace jobs, it also creates new ones.
Okay. Yeah, that's true.
So, we might need fewer people to do certain tasks, but we're also going to need more people who can do things like, analyze data, develop software, manage cybersecurity.
Right. So it's not just about like robots taking over
Exactly. It's about adapting to a changing world.
and making sure that people have the skills they need to succeed in that new world.
Exactly.
Okay, but I also want to kind of zoom out a little bit and think about the broader societal impact of all this.
Okay.
Like we've talked about worker shortages and budget constraints, but what does it all mean for the average person? How might this actually play out in their daily lives?
Well, I think the easiest way to think about it is to just imagine all of the services that you rely on every day.
Right.
Public transportation, trash collection, healthcare, education, emergency services.
It's a lot.
It is. And all of those things are impacted by the quality and the availability of public sector workers.
Right. So if there aren't enough workers, or if those workers aren't very good, then the quality of those services is going to suffer.
Exactly. You're going to have longer wait times.
Right.
Delays, things might not get done properly.
And people are going to get frustrated.
Yeah, absolutely. And it creates this kind of like domino effect.
Right, because one problem just leads to another.
Exactly. And then everybody's unhappy.
Okay, well, speaking of things that could make people unhappy, let's talk about those strikes that the unions have been warning about.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Because the DDB vice chair, Volker Geyer, I think that's how you say his name.
Yeah, it sounds right.
He basically said that strikes could affect things like hospitals and trash collection, which sounds pretty disruptive.
It does, and it raises a lot of questions about, public perception.
Yeah, like, will people support the strikes, or will they be annoyed by them?
Right, because on the one hand, people understand that workers have a right to fight for better pay and conditions. But on the other hand, nobody wants to be inconvenienced.
Yeah, and nobody wants to see essential services disrupted.
Exactly. So it's a really delicate situation.
And then there's the question of how the government is going to respond.
Right, because they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
Because if they give in to the union's demands, that could mean higher taxes,
right,
which nobody wants.
But if they don't give in, then they risk these prolonged strikes and even more disruption.
Exactly. So it's a really tough balancing act.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder about the long-term consequences of all this.
For sure. Like, what kind of precedent are we setting?
Right, and how is this going to affect the relationship between the government and the public sector workers? And how is it going to affect the quality of public services in the long run?
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah. It really is, and it just kind of highlights how interconnected all of these issues are.
Exactly. It's not just about pay, it's about the whole system.
Yeah, it's about people's lives.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think this is a good place to maybe take a pause and reflect a little bit.
Okay.
Because we've covered a lot of ground here, and I think it's important to just take a step back and think about what we've learned.
Yeah, and to maybe hear some of those human stories that we were talking about.
Right, because those are really what bring this whole issue to life.
Exactly. So let's do that when we come back.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about this public sector pay situation in Germany.
Yeah, we've really gone deep, haven't we?
We have, and I feel like I've learned a lot.
Yeah.
But I also feel like I'm left with this question of, what does it all mean? Like, what's the big takeaway here?
I think if you really boil it down, it's a question of values.
Okay.
Like, what do we as a society prioritize? Do we prioritize efficiency, fairness, individual ambition, collective well-being?
Yeah.
And these negotiations are kind of forcing Germany to confront those questions.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like this one negotiation is actually a microcosm of like much larger debates.
Exactly. And you see that playing out in those Reddit threads.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
You've got people arguing that public sector workers should just be grateful for their jobs.
Oh, yeah.
Others saying that you can't attract talent without paying a decent wage.
Yeah.
And then you've got that whole debate about the role of the private sector versus the public sector.
And who should be paying for all of this?
Exactly. It's like a philosophical tug of war.
It really is. And it makes me wonder, like, no matter what happens with these negotiations, there are going to be consequences.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, what if the government gives in to all the union's demands?
Yeah.
Could that lead to higher taxes down the road?
It's definitely a possibility.
Or what if they don't give in?
Mm-hmm.
Could that lead to more workers leaving the public sector?
Yeah, and then you have even worse shortages.
Right, and the quality of services could decline.
Exactly. It's a tough situation.
Yeah, it is. But I think what's important for our listeners to understand is this isn't just some abstract policy debate happening in a vacuum.
Right. This is real life.
This is stuff that affects people's everyday lives.
Remember those anecdotes from Reddit?
Oh, yeah, the people waiting months to register their car.
Yeah.
The parents struggling to find qualified teachers.
The patients waiting hours in the emergency room.
Exactly. Like, these are real problems.
And the outcome of these negotiations could make those problems better or worse.
Yeah, so it really does matter.
It really does.
Okay, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
But before we wrap things up, I want to kind of bring it back to this whole idea of digitalization.
Okay.
Because we talked about it a little bit earlier, but I think it's worth revisiting because some people see digitalization as a potential solution to this worker shortage problem.
Like if we can automate more tasks,
Yeah.
then maybe we won't need as many workers.
Right. But other people are worried that digitalization is going to eliminate jobs altogether.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword, for sure.
So how do we kind of navigate that tension?
Well, I think it comes down to education and training.
Yeah.
Like, we need to make sure that people have the skills they need to succeed in a digital world.
So it's not just about replacing workers with robots.
Exactly. It's about helping people adapt to a changing landscape.
Yeah. And I think there's also potential for digitalization to actually improve the quality of public services.
Oh, absolutely. Like, think about online portals, mobile apps, data analytics.
It's all about making things more efficient.
Yeah, and more user-friendly.
Right, because at the end of the day, it's all about serving the people.
Exactly.
Okay, so I think we've done a pretty good job of laying out all the complexities of this situation.
I think so.
But before we let our listeners go,
Yeah.
I want to leave them with one final question to ponder.
Okay, hit me.
What if better pay actually leads to a more efficient and effective public sector?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Like, what if, instead of viewing higher wages as a burden, we see it as an investment?
Right, because if you attract better talent, then the quality of services should improve.
Right, and maybe that means shorter wait times, smoother processes, better outcomes overall.
Exactly. It's about challenging our assumptions.
And looking at the big picture.
Exactly, and I think that's something that all of us need to do.
Yeah, especially when it comes to complex issues like this.
Absolutely, because there are no easy answers.
And there's no one right way to do things.
Exactly, so keep those brain cells firing, folks.
Don't just take our word for it.
Do your own research. Talk to people, think critically.
And most importantly, stay curious, because the future is out there waiting to be shaped.
And it's up to all of us to shape it.
Well said. All right, folks, that's it for our deep dive on public sector pay in Germany.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.